actually get there.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Good morning, powerful people. Today is Numbers Day, and welcome to this Workers by the Numbers blogcast presented by the Power at Work blog. I'm Alicia Modestino, a professor at Northeastern University and the executive director of Community to Community, a new initiative to promote the use of community-engaged research to make social change. This morning, we're going to talk about the latest job numbers, unemployment, wages, which is hot off the presses from the Bureau of Labor Statistics just 15 minutes ago. Joining me in analyzing the numbers is our expert panel with a lot of experience analyzing all sorts of labor market issues and advising policymakers and practitioners about the labor market. First, we have Dr. Aaron Sojourner, who is a senior researcher at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. Good morning, Aaron.
Morning.
And second, we have Dr. Harry Holzer, who is the John Lafarge Jr. Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy and former chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor. Good morning, Harry.
Morning, Alicia.
Thank you both for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. All right, let's do the numbers, as Kai Ryssdal likes to say. Here are the headline numbers from BLS's September Employment Situation Report. The unemployment rate held steady at 3.8% in September. Although this is the highest unemployment rate since February 2022, when the Fed first started raising rates, it's still pretty low by historical standards. Plus, we just saw weekly jobless claims have been trending lower for the past few weeks, possibly indicating a reluctance on the part of employers to cut payrolls. The economy created a whopping 336,000 jobs in September. We were all surprised by this number. So were all the other economists who were surveyed by the Wall Street Journal, who were expecting an increase of 170,000 jobs. We all missed this one. That's also an increase from August and July's numbers, which were about 230,000 jobs created in each of those months. That's a revision upward, which is a pretty considerable revision. It's also in line with what we would expect to see in a healthy but cooling jobs market, coming off a crazy fast average increase of 400,000 jobs per month in 2022. So far in 2023, we're seeing average growth of about 250 to 300,000 jobs per month. And so again, this is kind of at least in line with that, but surprising by what we were expecting for today. And then my final headline number here is average hourly earnings increased by 7 cents from August to September for an annual growth rate of 4.2% over the past 12 months. Last month, we saw wages rise at about the same pace for a similar annual increase of 4.3%. And we'll find out a little bit more probably what that means comparing to inflation, because we know it's not just the headline number of where wages go, but what you get to buy with it. All right, so let's turn to our experts. And I'm going to turn right to Harry at first to kind of riff off of maybe those wage numbers. Are these numbers good for workers, bad for workers? Are they a mixed bag?
I think they're very mixed. You have this contrast between the payroll growth, the 336,000, and Alicia, as you emphasized, the upward revisions of the past 2 months. Together, that averages out to 266,000 over the last 3 months. That's a lot bigger than we thought it was. As you said, those revisions for the previous 2 months were really large. So that number, if you look only at that suggests that there's still a lot of steam in the labor market and that things are still growing pretty fast. On the other hand, those wage numbers are very moderate. The 7 cents an hour that you mentioned, that number alone on an annual basis is just 2.5%, really just keeping up with inflation. Over the past 2 months, it's sort of like 2.7%. So you have this contrast between the job creation seems very strong, but the wage growth seems more moderate. When I look at the individual sectors behind the payroll growth, what I notice is that it's a little bit, the 336, the big jump is a little misleading because nearly 2/3 of that growth was just in 3 sectors, leisure hospitality, government, and healthcare. You look at many other sectors, the growth is much more moderate. You look at the sectors that might be sensitive to interest rates. Manufacturing was, I think, 17, construction 11. So in many sectors, the growth is much more moderate. Wage growth is moderate, and yet the eye-popping headline might a little bit overstate what's going on. There's just a lot more unevenness across these sectors. So when I look at these numbers, I would hope the Fed would not slam on the brakes. But we don't know which they're going to put the most weight on. So, I would say it's still pretty good for workers. But I do fear it will lead the Fed to hit the brakes harder on interest rates.
I think you had a really great point there about how uneven it is. And that makes it a really tricky situation for the Fed, right? I really wouldn't want to be in their shoes right now where they're trying to figure out, how do we take some steam out of a big number like that this month in terms of the jobs report? I'm sure Wall Street is freaking out right now, thinking about where interest rates might go. But at the same time, like I'm even hearing anecdotally about, layoffs in finance, right? And tech, have continued. So there is a lot of uneven out there. Aaron, what do you think? What are you seeing from your perspective? Is this good for workers, bad for workers, mixed bag? What's your take?
I think the job growth number is a bit of an anomaly in the report. It's a really strong, hot number. But if you look at all the other numbers in the report, it doesn't, they don't tell the same story. So, wage growth, as you all have been saying, continues to decelerate. And that's, I think, kind of the best number for judging heat, because, if labor supply is coming online, you can have job growth without adding pressure. And the way that you see that pressure show up is wage growth. And wage growth is over the whole economy. So anyway, the other thing is that hours didn't change. Average hours worked. That's another sort of signal of stability. All the labor force participation numbers, employment population rate, unemployment rates, didn't really change. The only change I could see really that seems at all important was the prime age employment rate, which is kind of a signal of core labor market strength. And that actually ticked down to 80.8, ticked down 0.1 percentage point from a very high. So I think, we've been in a red hot labor market. The Fed raised rates and more supply has come online, and things have moderated to just very strong, but not, it seems like sustainably strong. It still seems like it's sort of coasting towards it's decelerating, and hopefully it won't stall.
Yeah, I think it was really right to point out that there are a lot of sort of mixed numbers in this report in and of itself, right? We have this really big job growth number, and yet a lot of other things are just holding steady, right? So the unemployment rate's holding steady, labor force participation's holding steady, wages are, creeping up, but not really knocking it out of the park. And, yet we're seeing that big job number along with what we saw in the JOLTS report, right? With a big jump in job openings. So it's kind of curious to be thinking, how do we square all those numbers? And you kind of wonder if we're a little bit in a cross current here where things are changing, or at least some employers are in a holding pattern, wondering what's going to happen next, some of that unevenness, right, that Harry was talking about. Others are forging ahead where, we know that there's still a lot of revenge travel out there. There's still a lot of let's get out and go to a concert. There's the Swifty economics going on. That's, where people just getting out and doing more things. So you see that leisure and hospitality, growth. You see that growth in healthcare in those places, but not everywhere across the entire economy. And then again, with the wages, even with that increase you pointed out, and Harry did too, that's a deceleration. And yet we're not seeing that on the inflation side, right? So inflation has come down, but in the last few months, it's actually ticked back up just a little bit, right? So the CPI rose to 3.7% on an annualized rate in August, at least the latest report that we have. We don't have the newest one for September yet. And that was a little bit of an acceleration from the 3.3% we had seen in July. So it's a little, I think you have a good point there about, if it's really a red hot labor market, we'd be seeing wages, much stronger wage growth, right? That's probably the canary in the coal mine in terms of, is this a good thing for workers, is what's happening to wages. Okay, let's go beyond the headlines. So the reason why we invite you two terrific labor economists with us on this blogcast is because you know a lot about the labor market, and you always look deeper into this report because we're all labor nerds here. And we all focus on different numbers. So I would love to hear kind of, what's your stat of the day, or what's the thing you're looking at that tells us a little bit underneath how the economy is affecting maybe particular populations, or, even kind of an insight, or even a thing you're just looking for over the coming months. So Harry, I'm going to jump back to you. What's your stat of the day?
So again, I think the contrast between the big payroll jumps and the moderate wage increases is the single biggest thing going on. And then that really stunning unevenness across the sectors, which really suggests most sectors are not really hot. When you compare this with other numbers, and Alicia, I'm going to differ slightly with you, because when you look at, the uptick in inflation is mostly just driven by gasoline prices.
Yeah.
If you look at the PCE inflation rate, the core PCE inflation rate, which is really the one the Fed pays the most attention to, that has remained very moderate. And it has averaged 0.2% a month over the last 4 or 5 months, suggesting inflation only in the ballpark of 2.5%. So if that's the most important inflation number, it kind of suggests that both the wages and the inflation numbers are moderating. I like to put these numbers in context also with looking at productivity growth to see because not all wage growth is inflationary. And of course, we had a very big bump up in productivity in the last quarter. We don't know what the current quarter is, but the productivity growth numbers are averaging 1.5%, which means we could afford wage growth ahead of inflation. And if inflation is really, let's say somewhere in that 2.5 to 3%, we could be affording more wage growth without it being inflationary. And I think that's where we are right now. So when you look at all those numbers, I think it does contrast a lot with the hotness suggested by this payroll growth, again, mostly driven by 3 sectors. And like Aaron, I think if you only focus on the payroll growth, you're going to get a misleading picture, because putting those other numbers in perspective, it does suggest that moderation is still going on, and wage growth does not seem to be inflationary at this point.
Yeah, I think that decoupling of wage growth from, the overall level of inflation in the economy has been an important lesson coming out of COVID, that those two things do not have to be moving together for exactly the reasons you were talking about in terms of productivity. Also in terms of the margins, right, that employers have coming out of COVID, where they, had record profits, maybe lots of cash they were sitting on, they could afford to pay higher wages. I think also, you're totally right that most of that increase, has been gas prices. But it worries me a little bit that the shelter index has also been rising pretty much like throughout this. And again, but it's uneven, right? So in places like Massachusetts, we're in a housing crisis, although we're almost always in a housing crisis here. But in other places of the country, not so much. So I think it's really hard to make these like sort of big general statements with these kinds of reports where we know there's a lot of unevenness underneath it. Aaron, what's your stat of the day?
Yeah, I just want to double down on this prime age EPOP number, employment rate number for Americans between 25 and 54. That, this has been climbing up, and it's been an important signal of core labor market strength, because it kind of omits people who are on the margins of work, who are maybe still in school, or, close to thinking about retiring, or, in the sort of core working years, and suggests that the fact that it's ticking down, or it hasn't risen in the last couple months, is pretty strong evidence of a moderation of the, it's not like the labor market is out of, we've, I guess the concern is that maybe we've hit a ceiling here, and that, there's not a lot of core supply left to tap into, but we have seen big declines in employment rates for senior citizens, like basically people over 65 and sort of close to 65 has come down a lot. since the pandemic. And, I think if there's going to be growth in labor supply or employment rates, it's going to come there probably. So, I think there is this signal of, maybe there's not a ton more growth to be had here in the middle of the labor market, and maybe we should be focusing more on helping attach people who have been out.
Yeah, well, that's actually where I'm going with my stat of the day, or maybe non-stat of the day, depending on how you look at it. I really like to look at numbers that give us a little deeper understanding of the relationship between employer demand for particular workers and worker groups and where that's going. So for me, I'm really keeping an eye on that women's labor force participation rate, because during COVID, really plummeted sharply. We saw coming out of COVID, it dipped every time we hit a new wave of COVID, every time we hit a new school year, which is, now actually been documented as a seasonal effect. But, one thing I'm worried about is as we turn off those childcare stabilization subsidies from the American Rescue Plan Act that have been propping up the childcare industry, what does that mean for women's labor force participation? So in this jobs report, we saw that the labor force participation rate ticked down slightly for women, from 59 to 58.9, so that 0.1%, but it ticked up for men, right? So again, we're seeing that divergence between men and women that we see every September as we get back to school. So I'm not as worried about this month, but what I am worried about is future months. And I really do think that by the end of the year, we will probably see some of the effects of that pullback in terms of the subsidization of childcare affecting labor force participation for women, because we've certainly seen the opposite, where when we were subsidizing it, right? So ARPA provided, $24 billion in stabilization to childcare centers that helped over 200,000 providers stay in business. We actually have gotten to record levels of women participating in the labor market, 25 to 54-year-olds hitting 78% labor force participation, and women with children under the age of 5 hitting 70%, which is like an all-time high. So it just sort of stands to reason that it's hard to see how that's going to be maintained when we pull those subsidies back. And so there's some estimates, by the Century Foundation saying we could see 70,000 facilities going out of business. We could see 3.2 million children without childcare, and that largely falls on moms to fill the gap. So whether it quite comes to that kind of childcare Armageddon, I'm not entirely sure, but I think we're going to see it in the numbers. And I don't usually go on record saying we're going to see something, but I feel pretty confident in that one. Okay, final question. So, we like to think about not just what happened this month, but in the longer term, right? What do we think this means for worker power? So Aaron, I'm going to start off with you this time. Have workers been gaining or losing power over this last year or so in 2023? Where do we think we're at in terms of, the arc that swings between employers and workers?
I think we came into the year at a very high level of worker power in the labor market. 2022, I think, was really a peak. And once the Fed started raising rates and tamping down labor demand, that sort of started eroding some worker bargaining power. And it's, we've seen that continue. I guess the only thing I would say is that we also see workers taking action to join together and, try to form unions, unionize workers, trying to go on, taking strong positions in bargaining with employers, striking sometimes, or just, achieving strong contracts like the Teamsters with UPS. And so that's some countervailing force there. And, I think we have more workers on strike right now than we've had in a long time. So I think the macro forces are sort of trending down, but there are groups of workers who are trying to build power together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Harry, you get the final word before I answer. Have workers been gaining or losing power over the last, 6 to 12 months? And where do you see things heading for the rest of 2023?
I would sort of agree with Aaron. The unionized workers clearly have enough power to get themselves better, to strike and get themselves better wage packages, but always remembering that unions only represent 6% of the private labor force. So most workers aren't in that situation. And I do think workers do still have some muscle left, but when you look at these wage numbers, it does suggest that they are not as confident of their bargaining power, certainly compared to a year ago when the wage increases were very strong. Keep in mind that before, a lot of workers had piled up savings from all the government bailout money, from not spending much during the downturn. Most of those are gone, at least for the median worker and below that. So, so workers can still get some leverage out of what remains a reasonably tight labor market. But again, knowing that the Fed could continue to tamp down that demand with higher interest rates, I think their leverage is limited. And you see that in their behavior, that they are not nearly as confident as they were a year ago in demanding high wages. Most of the great resignation is gone. Quit rates have more or less come down near where they were before. So it remains kind of a mixed picture, but definitely for most of the labor force decelerating and moving down. And we still hope there's enough left for some real wage growth for these folks, even after inflation.
Yeah, I think you both raise a really important point. And I guess, sort of my final take on this is that, workers have managed to reclaim some of the power that they had lost over the last 1 or 2 decades, even where we've been in these kind of jobless recoveries, very slow recoveries. That was very different coming out of COVID, where, once we reopened everything, workers gained the upper hand. They were in demand. They were needed. We saw, teenagers getting employed. We saw women coming back into the labor market. We saw lots of groups. We saw at one point really, Black workers making gains on white workers. That's really stalled out. Even, closing those racial gaps has stalled out. So I think we're at that moment where the market forces have done as much as they can for worker power, and we need to turn to the institutions. And that's where, you were both mentioning unions. You're absolutely right, Harry. It only affects 6% of the labor market. And yet some of the agreements that they do strike can have ripple effects, right, across the economy. So you think about what the Writers Guild of America managed to get from the motion picture and television producers, not just about wages, but also about how AI is going to be used, right? How they're going to be able to negotiate all sorts of royalties and things like that. So sometimes, right, these agreements go further. You think about a little bit of what the UAW is doing right now, right? So Shawn Fain's going to say something later today about whether the intensified bargaining with the Detroit 3 automakers has produced enough progress to forestall more walkouts, right? And he's got it kind of like production facility by production facility, like when are we going to walk out if we need to? And so that's definitely been helping to push those wages higher. They're getting potentially raises in excess of 20% over the life of a contract. And with cost of living adjustment, they could see close to 30% increases in pay. Those are pretty big, could have ripple effects. And then the last, union action we've been seeing with Kaiser Permanente. I mean, this is the largest healthcare strike in U.S. history. It's only in its second day. It's going to end this weekend because workers agreed only to strike for 3 days, because it's a little different when you're a healthcare worker and it's striking compared to maybe an auto worker. But, Kaiser's already agreed to across the board wage increases. And now, healthcare workers are really negotiating for some of those other things in terms of staffing, outsourcing, and other things to reduce turnover coming out of the pandemic. So I think, when we think about labor market institutions, we have to also forget there's other things like the minimum wage. There are a number of different institutions that maybe should be brought to bear to stabilize the gains that workers have made. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I want to thank today's guests, Harry and Aaron, for their expert insights and their continued excellent work. I also want to thank Asia Sims, our producer. And before you go, Seth Harris would be very cross with me if I didn't remind you to subscribe to the Power at Work blog so we can keep you updated on all the great content that we're producing. And thanks for watching. We will see you back again on